Hey everyone, and welcome to the deep dive. We're diving into some pretty awesome stuff today. Angular version 19.
It's a big one.
Lot to unpack there.
Yeah, this is a really interesting one.
It is. But I think this deep dive is going to be super helpful for anyone who's a web developer, anyone interested in, how the web is constantly getting better and faster and more interactive.
And it's great to see Angular kind of at the forefront of that.
Absolutely. So one of the biggest things I'm excited about in Angular 19 is what they're calling incremental hydration.
Right.
But I think for folks who may not be familiar with that term,
Yeah.
can you kind of give us like a high-level explanation of what that means?
Sure. So I think the easiest way to think about it is that if you're building a complex web app and you've got tons of features, traditionally all that JavaScript, all those features needed to be loaded up front.
Yeah, it could get pretty heavy sometimes.
It gets really heavy. So you're waiting for everything to load before you can actually interact with the page. Incremental hydration lets you pick and choose what loads first.
So it's kind of like choosing to download just the audio track of a video if you're on like a limited data plan. You still get the core experience, but you can get the rest later.
That's a great analogy, yeah.
Yes.
Exactly. You're prioritizing. It's all about prioritizing what the user sees first.
Gotcha.
And making that a really smooth and fast experience.
Yeah.
You might have seen some of those visual cues they used in the Angular demo. They had the grayscale for components that hadn't loaded yet.
Right.
And then that kind of pulsing as they downloaded it, and then a purple border
Right.
when it's fully hydrated.
Right.
So really clever ways to kind of visualize how this lazy loading is happening.
It's cool to see that happen like in real time.
Yeah.
Now, what happens if a user tries to interact with the component before it's fully loaded?
Right. So that's where event replay comes in. So event replay is actually a technology that's been powering Google search for years.
Interesting.
But now it's enabled by default in Angular 19.
Okay.
What that means is that even if the JavaScript for a component hasn't loaded yet, it captures the user's interactions.
Okay.
Like if they click a button or try to type something in.
Right.
And then once the component is ready, it replays those actions smoothly.
That's pretty amazing. So they're using the same tech that handles like billions of Google searches every day to make sure our little Angular apps are super responsive.
They're really committed to performance, which is great for us as developers.
It is. It is. So incremental hydration is super cool. But there's also, we're seeing this emergence of route level render mode.
Right. Right.
Can you break that down for us?
Yeah. So it's basically about choosing how different routes in your app are rendered. You can choose to have them rendered on the server. You can have them pre-rendered as part of your build process, or you could just leave them to be rendered on the client side.
So it's giving us a lot more granular control over how we're handling that rendering process.
Yeah. I mean, the great thing about it is it lets you fine-tune the performance of your app for different parts of it.
Right.
So, maybe you've got like a blog section with hundreds of articles. You could pre-render those articles server-side to make them load really fast.
Yeah.
But then you have something like a user dashboard that needs really up-to-date data. Then you'd probably stick with client-side rendering.
I see.
So you kind of get to optimize each piece.
Right. I also heard they have this new server route interface that lets you resolve those route parameters during the pre-rendering process.
Exactly. And that's really helpful for, pages that have dynamic content.
Yeah.
So imagine like an e-commerce site where each product has its own page with a unique ID in the URL. With this, you can fetch the data for that product on the server before the page is even sent to the browser.
That makes a ton of sense. So we've talked about incremental hydration. We've talked about route level render mode. What about server-side rendering, but without zone.js?
Right.
Is zoneless Angular still on the roadmap?
It is. It is, yeah. They're making good progress there. The goal is to make server-side rendering even more efficient.
Okay.
By focusing on things like pending requests and navigation events as kind of the main signals for when a page is fully rendered.
Okay, so for developers who are maybe a little intimidated by like the idea of ditching zone.js, what's the main benefit they can expect to see?
It comes down to performance. It's all about making things faster and smoother. By removing that reliance on zone.js, they can simplify how change detection works.
Gotcha.
And really kind of streamline the whole rendering process, especially on the server.
That makes sense. So we've talked a lot about performance, but I mean, at the end of the day, we also need tools that just make our lives as developers easier, right? So what's Angular 19 doing to kind of improve that developer experience?
I think one of the most exciting things is hot module replacement, or HMR,
Okay.
for both styles and templates.
So what does that mean for me? Like, what does that look like?
So you're working on your code, you make a change to your CSS
Hmm?
or your HTML, and instead of waiting for the whole page to reload,
Right?
you see those changes immediately in your browser
Without losing the app state.
without losing the app state. It's magic.
It is magic. That sounds amazing.
It's a huge productivity boost.
Yeah.
And now, with Angular 19 style, HMR is enabled by default.
Yeah.
So you get that magic right out of the box.
I like free magic.
Exactly.
So HMR is great for those quick updates, but what about standalone components?
Right.
Are those still a thing?
Standalone components are definitely here to stay.
Okay.
The last developer survey showed that over 90% of Angular devs are using them, which is huge.
Yeah.
And Angular 19 is making them even better.
So what kind of improvements can we expect to see there?
So first off, they've got a new schematic that can automatically update your projects to use standalone components more effectively.
Okay.
And they've also added a new compiler flag. It's called the strict standalone flag. And this helps enforce those modern Angular practices, make sure you're not mixing the old way with the new way.
So it's like having a little guide to make sure you're doing things the right way.
Exactly.
That's awesome.
It's super helpful, especially for those who are, maybe working with older projects
Yeah.
and they're trying to modernize them. And they haven't forgotten about testing either.
Okay. Testing, that's a big one.
A lot of developers are still using Karma, right?
Mhm.
Especially with those legacy projects.
So is Karma going away?
Well, they are encouraging the move towards real browser testing, but they also know that Karma is still important to a lot of people. So what they've done is they've introduced developer preview support for Karma to use the new SBuild-based application builder.
So they're finding a way to bridge that gap
Exactly.
for those who aren't quite ready to make that jump.
Yeah. It means you get faster build times for your tests,
Okay.
better compatibility with the modern Angular features. So it's a win-win.
That's great. So what about the future of testing, like long term?
They're evaluating different test runners right now. They're trying to figure out what's going to be the best option moving forward. So, stay tuned. We should hear more about that sometime in the first half of 2025.
Okay.
So they're working on it.
So performance, developer experience, testing, but there's also the big one, right? Security.
Right.
What's Angular 19 doing to help us build more secure apps?
One of the key things they're doing is focusing on something called Content Security Policy, or CSP.
Okay.
They've got a new feature. It's still kind of in developer preview. It's called Auto CSP. And this can automatically generate a hash-based CSP.
Okay. Can you break that down for non-security experts? Like, what does that actually do for my app?
Think of it as a set of rules you give to the browser. It tells the browser where it's allowed to load resources from.
Okay.
So you're saying, hey, you can only load scripts from this domain or images from this domain and a hash-based CSP.
Mm-hmm.
It adds an extra layer of security
Okay.
by including the unique hash of each script in your HTML file.
So it's kind of like having a bouncer at the door of your website, right?
Exactly.
Checking IDs, making sure only the code that you approved gets to run.
Exactly.
That's a great way to think about it.
Yeah. And the great thing about Auto CSP is that it does all the hard work for you.
Right. So it's not something that I, as a developer, need to go in and like manually configure a bunch of stuff.
It's trying to make security easier.
Takes care of it for me.
Exactly. It's still a developer preview, but it's a big step toward making Angular apps just more secure.
Out of the box.
Out of the box.
That's fantastic. Okay, so performance, dev experience, testing, security. I feel like we're missing one big piece of the puzzle.
Reactivity.
Reactivity.
One of the most powerful parts of Angular.
It really is.
It's what makes our apps so dynamic and so efficient.
Absolutely.
And they've made some pretty significant advancements in reactivity with this release.
Like what? Give us the highlights.
So first of all, we're seeing some key APIs get stabilized.
Huh?
Things like inputs, outputs, and view queries.
Yeah.
They've been in developer preview for a while.
Right.
So it's great to see them become a stable part of the framework.
Excellent.
But I think the most exciting news is the introduction of linked signals.
Ooh. Linked signals. Tell me more.
So think about this common scenario, right?
Okay.
You've got some state in your app,
Mm-hmm.
and then you've got other state that depends on that first state.
Okay.
So a good example is like a drop-down menu,
Mm-hmm.
where the options in the drop-down change based on what the user selects in another drop-down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've run into that before. It can be kind of a pain to manage.
It can be a real pain.
Yeah.
Linked signals are designed to make that easier.
So how do they do that?
They let you create a signal
Okay.
that's derived from another signal. So whenever that parent signal changes, the link signal automatically updates. It's like this chain reaction
Okay.
of reactivity that keeps your UI consistent without you having to write a ton of code.
So if I select a different option in my first dropdown, the linked signal for the second dropdown is automatically going to know,
Exactly.
okay, I need to update my list of options now.
Yep. And even cooler, if that original array of options changes for some reason, the link signal will automatically adjust.
Wow. That's powerful.
It is.
So it sounds like linked signals are a huge win for simplifying state management, especially in those complex UIs.
Absolutely.
But you did mention that they're still experimental, right?
Yeah, it's always a good idea to be a little cautious with experimental features.
Right.
But the Angular team really wants developers to try them out. Give feedback. This is your chance to help shape the future of Angular reactivity.
Okay, so we've got link signals. That's for that synchronous state dependencies.
Right.
But what about when we're dealing with like asynchronous operations,
Yeah.
like fetching data from an API?
That's where resources come in.
Okay, resources. Break it down for me because I think I'm struggling to wrap my head around that concept.
So think of a resource as having three main parts.
Okay.
You have the request function,
Mhm.
you have the loader function, and then you have the resource instance itself.
Got it.
So the request function defines what data you need to fetch. Often that's based on signals like route parameters,
Okay.
user input.
Yep.
The loader function is the one that actually goes out and fetches the data using something like Fetch or the Angular HTTP client.
Okay.
And the resource instance is kind of like the bridge between the synchronous world of signals and the asynchronous world of fetching data.
So it's managing the loading, the resolved, the error state.
Exactly. It gives you signals that you can subscribe to in your components to track the status of that request.
Okay.
So you can easily like show a loading indicator
Right.
while you're waiting for the data and then display the content once it loads.
And it's all kind of hooked into that signal graph.
Exactly. It's all integrated. So if a signal that your request function depends on changes, the resource will automatically refetch the data. So it keeps everything in sync
Without me having to like manually manage all that.
without you having to do all that work.
That's awesome. So we've got linked signals for the synchronous state, resources for handling that asynchronous data.
Right.
But what about effects?
Right.
They've been in developer preview for a while, right?
Yeah. Effects are still in developer preview.
Yeah.
But they're getting a lot of attention.
Okay.
The Angular team is really focused on refining them.
So not quite ready for prime time, but getting there?
They're getting there. And they're really important because they handle those side effects. So they want to make sure they get them right.
Makes sense. And what about, while we're talking about experimental features, zoneless Angular? That's still a work in progress, right?
It is.
It is.
It's a big one.
It is a big one.
It's a major effort to get rid of that dependency on zone.js,
Right.
which has been part of Angular for so long.
They're essentially rewriting parts of Angular to work without that.
It's a big undertaking.
It is. So how's it going?
They're making good progress. They've already added support for server-side rendering with zoneless Angular.
Okay.
And they're working on improving the testing experience.
That's great.
And, they even partnered with the Google Fonts team who are using zoneless Angular in production
Wow.
to get real-world feedback.
So they're really putting it through its paces.
They're really testing it out.
And when can we expect to actually see this in a stable release?
They're hoping to move zoneless Angular to developer preview sometime in 2025.
Okay.
But in the meantime, they want people to try it out, give feedback, and you can even create a new zoneless Angular project right from the Angular CLI.
That's cool. So Angular 19 shaping up to be a huge release, tons of focus on performance, dev experience, and really kind of evolving that core reactivity system.
Yeah.
But what about Angular Material and the CDK?
Oh, yeah.
Any goodies in store for us there?
Definitely. So Angular Material and the CDK, they're getting some love too.
That's great. Tell me more. What's new?
So one of the things that I'm really excited about is the Enhanced Theming API.
Okay.
In the past, creating custom themes could be a little verbose. You have to define all those styles for every component.
It'd be a lot.
Yeah. But now with Angular 19, they've introduced a much more streamlined syntax using something called the mat.theme mixin.
Okay.
So it's much easier to create and apply custom themes across your whole application.
So much less code duplication.
Exactly.
And that makes things easier to maintain.
Absolutely. And to make things even better, they've added a new API in Sass. It's It's called the Override API.
Okay.
And this lets you customize the styles of individual components without having to copy and paste huge chunks of code.
It's a much more surgical approach to styling.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we have to talk about one of the most requested features for the CDK, which is two-dimensional drag and drop.
Finally.
It's here.
It only took like 300 upvotes on GitHub.
Right. Over 300 upvotes on GitHub, and it's finally here.
And it's a game changer.
It is.
Makes it so much easier to create drag and drop interfaces that work both in the X and Y direction.
Yep. And you know it's already being used by the Google Cloud Console team in their BigQuery product.
So you know it's been battle tested.
It's production ready.
Production ready. And while we're talking about things that people have been asking for, what about support for tab reordering?
Oh, yeah. That's in there, too.
Another win for community feedback. I love that.
That's great.
And I have to ask, what about the time picker component? That's been on people's wish lists for a while.
The long-awaited time picker is finally here.
It is.
Over 1,300 upvotes on GitHub.
Wow.
They finally delivered.
That's awesome.
It's fully accessible. It follows the material design spec. It's a really nice, user-friendly way to let people select specific times.
That's fantastic. So Angular material and the CDK are definitely not being left behind.
No.
They're keeping up with the core framework
They are.
and really delivering on what developers are asking for.
Absolutely. And we're not done yet.
There's more. We're not done yet.
There's always more. There are a bunch of smaller but really important improvements in Angular 19 that just make it a joy to work with.
Like what?
So one thing is that they've added support for reporting unused imports
Okay.
in standalone components.
Love it. Keeping my code clean.
Exactly. You know, help keep your code clean and efficient.
It's like a built-in code linter that's always watching out for me.
Exactly.
I like that.
And they've got a new command line flag that lets you define environment variables right in your build process.
So convenient.
Super convenient. And for all the template lovers out there,
Yeah.
they finally added support for local variables.
Wait, local variables in templates? That's a game changer.
I know.
People have been asking for that for
It
years.
took a while, but they finally figured it out.
That's awesome. So my templates are about to get so much cleaner,
Exactly.
so much more readable.
Exactly. It makes template development more enjoyable and more efficient.
This is all incredibly exciting. Angular 19 is shaping up to be a really groundbreaking release.
It is.
But before we get too carried away, I think it's important to acknowledge something that we've kind of touched on a little bit throughout our discussion here, which is the incredible role that the Angular community plays
Yes.
in shaping the framework.
Absolutely.
The Angular community is truly one of its greatest strengths.
It is. It's a global network of passionate developers.
It is, and I think that's one of the things that really sets Angular apart.
It does. I mean, you see so many developers willing to help each other out, answer questions on Stack Overflow, contribute to discussions on GitHub. They share their expertise at conferences and meetups. It's amazing.
And the Angular team really seems to recognize and value that community. They're constantly engaging with developers, listening to that feedback,
Absolutely.
and incorporating community contributions into the framework itself.
Which is fantastic.
It's really cool to see.
It's a true testament to the power of open source software.
It is. It's a beautiful thing to witness.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive.
We have.
We've seen some really game-changing features and improvements in Angular 19.
Yes. And I think, for me, one of the key takeaways is just how much thought and care the Angular team has put into making this release really empower developers and prioritize things like performance, the developer experience, security. It's really impressive. It is. It's exciting to think about what this means for the future of web development.
Absolutely.
So stay tuned for part 2 of our deep dive, where we're going to delve even deeper into some of those groundbreaking features and enhancements that we just kind of touched on today.
I can't wait. Welcome back to the deep dive. We're continuing our journey through Angular version 19. And this time, we're really going to focus on how it can help us modernize our existing applications.
Yeah. It's easy to get caught up in all this shiny new features.
Right.
But a huge chunk of the Angular community is working with legacy projects.
Absolutely.
So it's great that Angular 19 hasn't forgotten about us.
Yeah, for sure. And one of the big things they're doing to help with that is making standalone components the default for new projects.
Yeah. I love standalone components. They're so much simpler and more intuitive than the old way of doing things.
Absolutely. And it seems like a lot of developers have already made the switch. The last survey showed over 90% of Angular developers are using them.
Wow, that's impressive.
So now when you create a new component, directive, or pipe in Angular 19. It's going to be generated as a standalone entity by default.
I love that they're really pushing towards that more modern Angular architecture. But what about those of us who are still working with legacy projects? Like ripping everything out and starting over isn't really an option for most teams.
No, for sure. And they've got you covered there too. Angular 19 comes packed with a bunch of schematics that can help you modernize your existing code base.
Schematics are a lifesaver for refactoring. Like, what are some of the ways these new schematics can help us modernize our apps?
Well, one of the really helpful ones is the schematic that converts your constructor-based dependency injection to using the inject function,
Right.
which is much cleaner and more concise.
It is.
And the schematic makes that transition so much easier.
Huge win for readability and maintainability. Any other standouts?
Yeah. Another one that I really like is the schematic for migrating eagerly loaded routes to lazy loaded routes.
Lazy loading. Love it.
It's so important for performance, especially as your application grows. And this schematic makes it much easier to implement without having to restructure everything manually.
Yeah, lazy loading is like that secret weapon for building performant web apps.
It really is.
Now, what about those of us who are still using the old decorator-based APIs for inputs, queries, and outputs? Is there an easy way to update our code? To use those new signal-based APIs that we talked about?
Absolutely. They got schematics for that too. They can automatically update your code to use the latest signal-based APIs so you can take advantage of all that power and efficiency.
It's amazing how much effort they've put into making these migrations as painless as possible. It really shows a commitment to supporting developers who are working with those older projects.
Yeah, they want everyone to be able to benefit from the latest and greatest features. And that modernization extends beyond just the core framework. If you're using it Angular or Google Maps, they've added support for the new clustering API.
Clustering is essential for handling large data sets of markers on a map without sacrificing performance. That's a really nice addition.
It is. And on the topic of moving towards more modern tools, they've also made the decision to remove the protractor builder from the Angular CLI.
Yeah, that was a big announcement. Protractor's been around for a while, so why remove it now?
Well, they're really pushing towards real browser testing,
Okay.
which means running your tests directly in a real browser
Right.
instead of a simulated environment. It gives you more accurate results and better reflects how your application is actually going to behave for your users.
That makes a lot of sense. But that means developers who are used to Protractor will need to switch to a new tool, right?
Yep. But there are a lot of great options out there. Cypress, Playwright, and WebDriver.io are all popular choices.
Can you give us a quick overview of what each tool brings to the table?
Sure. So Cypress is known for being very user-friendly. It's got features like real-time reloading, so you can see your changes instantly in the browser as you write tests.
Sounds like a dream come true for testing.
And it's got automatic waiting, so you don't have to mess around with those manual waits and timeouts in your tests.
Okay, so it's super beginner friendly.
It's great for beginners.
Right.
Now, Playwright is another awesome option. It's really good if you need cross-browser support.
So if my app needs to work seamlessly on different browsers,
Exactly.
Playwright's a good choice.
It's a great choice. You can automate all sorts of browser interactions, file uploads, downloads, even geolocation. It's really powerful.
That's impressive.
And then there's WebDriver.io.
Okay.
This one is built on the WebDriver protocol. So it's got a ton of flexibility and customization options.
Okay, so it's really powerful.
It's really powerful. It integrates well with other tools and services. So if you've got a complex testing setup, WebDriver.io is a great choice.
Sounds like there's a tool for everyone, really.
Absolutely. It just depends on your needs.
But I imagine it can be a bit overwhelming for developers who are so used to Protractor to suddenly have to learn a whole new testing framework.
It's definitely an adjustment. But the good news is there are lots of resources out there. The Angular community is super helpful.
Yeah, the community is amazing.
They've got blog posts, tutorials, online communities dedicated to all these tools.
That's great, so you don't have to go it alone.
Exactly. And the Angular team is working on documentation and guidance to help make the switch as smooth as possible.
It's great to see them being proactive like that.
Yeah. They want to make sure no one gets left behind.
Now, one more modernization effort that I wanted to touch on is the migration to the S-Build-based application builder.
Oh, yeah. S-Build is that super fast JavaScript bundler
Right.
that everyone's talking about. And Angular 19 gives you the option to migrate.
So Faster build times?
Significantly faster.
Music to my ears.
Yeah.
But what about those of us who are, like, really invested in Webpack?
You don't have to switch.
Okay, good.
You can stick with the Webpack-based builder if you're happy with it.
Yeah.
But the Angular team really believes that S-Build offers some big advantages in terms of speed and simplicity. So they're encouraging people to try it out.
I can definitely see the appeal, especially if it means shaving minutes off my build times. But what about potential challenges with migrating, especially for projects that rely on specific Webpack configurations or plugins?
Yeah, that's a valid concern.
Right.
Migrating to a new build tool always comes with some hurdles, but the Angular team is working hard to make the transition smooth. They're creating guides, documenting the process, addressing common issues. They really want to make it as seamless as possible.
It's great that they're being so proactive about it. It makes me feel more confident about exploring S-Build as an option.
Yeah. And they're also actively seeking feedback from the community to make sure this migration path is working for everyone.
Love it.
So they're really committed to getting this right.
It's clear that Angular is dedicated to evolving in a way that empowers developers and helps us embrace those modern best practices.
Yeah.
And it's amazing to see how much they value community feedback throughout that process.
Absolutely. But before we wrap up this part, let's circle back to something we touched on earlier. The retirement of Protractor and that shift towards real browser testing.
Right. It was a big decision, but it feels like the right time. Protractor served the Angular community well, but the testing landscape has evolved,
It really has.
and there are just better tools available now.
And the Angular team is all in on real browser testing. They see that as the future of Angular testing.
And for those who are new to the concept, can you just quickly explain what real browser testing is and why it's so important?
So in the past, end-to-end testing often relied on these simulated browser environments,
Right.
which meant that your tests weren't always running under the same conditions as your users would actually experience.
Right.
With real browser testing, your tests are executed directly in a real browser.
So it's the real deal.
It's the real deal, just like a user would interact with your app.
So it takes away that guesswork
Exactly.
and ensures that your tests are really accurate.
Exactly. But it does mean that developers need to learn these new tools and frameworks.
Right. So can you just remind us quickly about those tools? What are some of the best options out there?
So we've got Cypress, great for ease of use and developer experience.
Right.
It's got features like real-time reloading, so you can see your changes instantly in the browser,
Right. Instant feedback.
and automatic waiting. So no more messing with manual waits and timeouts in your tests.
Okay. Cypress.
And there's Playwright.
Mm-hmm.
This one excels at cross-browser support. So you can run your tests across Chrome, Firefox, Safari, make sure your application works consistently.
Makes sense. Cross-browser compatibility is essential these days.
It is. And finally, we have WebDriver IO.
Okay.
Super powerful and flexible framework built on that WebDriver protocol.
So it gives you a lot of control.
Tons of control. And integrates really well with other tools and services. So it's perfect for those complex testing scenarios.
Great. So there's a tool for everyone.
Absolutely. Just depends on what your needs are.
Right. Now, with all these options, I'm sure some developers might feel overwhelmed, having to switch from Protractor to something new.
I get it. But the Angular community is here to help.
Thank goodness for the community.
Tons of resources, blog posts, tutorials, online communities. You're not alone in this.
It's great to have that support system.
Yeah, and of course, the Angular team is working on documentation and best practices to guide everyone through this change.
This has been an amazing deep dive. It's clear that Angular 19 is about more than just shiny new toys. It's about thoughtfully evolving the framework
Absolutely.
and making it easier for developers to embrace modern practices.
And we've only scratched the surface. There's still so much more to uncover in Angular 19.
Stay tuned for the final part of our deep dive. We'll be exploring even more of what Angular 19 has to offer. Welcome back to the deep dive. It's hard to believe we're already at the final part of our exploration of Angular version 19.
You know, right? It's flown by.
It has. We've covered so much. Performance optimizations, new reactivity APIs, testing tools, Angular material.
A lot to digest. But, you know, through all of that, one theme has really stood out to me.
What's that?
The power of the Angular community.
Oh, absolutely. The Angular community is one of its greatest strengths, for sure. It's amazing to see this network of developers from all over the world
Yeah.
sharing their knowledge, contributing to open source, helping each other out.
It's really inspiring. It's a testament to that whole collaborative spirit of open source software.
It is. I'm always so impressed by how willing Angular developers are to help each other out, whether it's answering questions on Stack Overflow, contributing to those GitHub discussions, or just sharing their expertise at conferences and meetups.
Yeah, it's a real community.
There's a real sense of camaraderie.
It's like a global family of developers united by this passion for building amazing things with Angular.
It's contagious. That passion is what keeps me excited about learning and experimenting and pushing the boundaries of what we can do with Angular.
Me too. Yeah. It's a constant source of inspiration and motivation. It reminds me that we're not just, typing away at our keyboards. We're building something meaningful, something that can have a real impact on people's lives.
Absolutely. And with Angular 19, we have even more powerful tools to bring those ideas to life.
This release is a true collaboration between the Angular team and the community. It shows that Angular's listening, it's evolving, it's adapting to the needs of developers.
It's exciting to see where Angular goes from here with this focus on performance, developer experience, and that community-driven innovation. I have no doubt it's going to continue to be a leader in the world of front-end development.
Absolutely. Angular has come such a long way, and it's only getting better.
Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into Angular version 19. It's been an incredible journey. We've explored some groundbreaking new features, and I hope we've inspired you to see what's possible with this amazing framework.
It's been a pleasure. This is just the beginning of your Angular 19 adventure.
There's always more to learn, more to explore, more to build.
Keep coding, keep experimenting, and keep pushing the boundaries of what you can create on the web.
Until next time, happy coding.